what has Russell Wilson done to people that make him public enemy number one? Like, why do people just love to hate on Russell Wilson? Why are people infatuated with hating on Russell Wilson? It seems so Bush League, and it's not like who's like an enemy in sports, right? Like a Christian Laettner back at Duke, right? Like who are the villains? A Pat Bev of the world, you know, like
Rodman.
Dennis Rodman, right? Like Russell Wilson does not fit that mold.
No.
And that's what's so confusing to me is he's the opposite of a prototypical villain. It's almost like they love to hate him because he's on the surface, like we said, a little corny, always positive, always optimistic, and maybe sometimes robotic. It's like grounds for hating someone. Come on, man.
No, it's just I think the people that have a problem with it have their own deeply masked insecurities that apparently affect their day-to-day life.
I guess
it's pretty sad. Like, that's the thing is, like, what a concept it is to cover a sports team and, you know, talk about, you know, the team, how they're performing, and just leaving it at that, but not diving into the personal stuff, the personal attacks, the personal, like I said, the slander that we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of it on social media.
Yeah.
You type in Russell Wilson's name, I guarantee you the results that are going to pop up, they're all going to be negative.
So the one interesting part of the report that came out that I do want to kind of dissect here, outside of the whole Pete Carroll notion, is that Russell Wilson apparently in this report from The Athletic wanted Sean Payton, dating back to when he was still with Seattle, right? So, but I'm more so talking about it as Sean Payton and Russell Wilson are now obviously married in the sense of quarterback-head coach relationship, right? I think Sean Payton, the one thing with Sean Payton is we've seen him with Drew Brees, we've seen him with Teddy Bridgewater, we've seen him with Taysom Hill, among others. He has an ability to put up points and generate offensive success regardless of the quarterback that he's had with. And it's not like Russell Wilson is not Davis Mills.
No.
Like Russell Wilson is not John Kitna.
No,
Russell Wilson played awful last year, about as awful of a season as you can have.
And he still went 16-11, which is weird. Like, from a touchdown to interception ratio, it's like 16 is a low for him.
We're talking about Josh Freeman here.
Yeah.
You know,
sacked 55 times.
This is Josh Rosen.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. And, you know, the links, like, I believe that. I believe that Russell Wilson wanted Sean Payton back then. You want to know what tells me that? Is like after 2020, when some of the rumblings started coming out about Russ could look to be traded, the teams that apparently were reported, remember the Raiders were one of the teams that he would sign off because he has a no trade clause? The New Orleans Saints were also another team.
Yeah.
And who is there? Sean Payton.
I think that dynamic is going to be a fantastic one. And look, maybe I'm Mr. Optimist. Maybe I'm not as hardcore and down on the team like other media members are and people in this town. I'm sorry that I don't want to have a great – I'm a naturally optimistic person, and when you look at this team on paper, Cody, they have talent. Last year, I think it was a lethal cocktail of new quarterback in a new situation and a rookie head coach who was in way over his head.
Well, and I think another thing that the Athletic article mentioned well was they did talk about, like, the offensive dysfunction. Like, players on – and this is what I've said on the show, too. Like, I've talked to players as well that have said that the offense, they were kind of like, we don't really have, like, a designed game plan. Like, we're just throwing stuff against the wall and seeing if it catches on. Like, with Nathaniel Hackett and with Russell Wilson – I felt like that relationship and that dynamic between those two guys was Russ obviously had a lot of power, right? Because you just signed a massive contract to be in Denver. Nathaniel Hackett, you're a first-year head coach. There was a lot of trust given to, like, Russell Wilson to give him, and he signed off on by George Payton, to give Russell Wilson whatever he felt he needed to be successful this year. And, you know, I think you can maybe even make the argument he did too much, and that ended up hurting him at the end of the day. But they didn't have an offensive identity, and it doesn't help. Like, it's hard to establish an identity when you have how many different starting offensive line, units throughout the entire season.
Well, and let's rebuttal to the thought that we had talked about, as the offseason had started, that their offensive scheme was so complex that they had to pivot early on in the season. They never found their footing.
They threw it away after week.
Like, they never got off the bus.
Week 4.
Right? I mean, they never got going whatsoever. It's like they were trying to drive a car with no engine.
I would say the only time we really saw, like, in the first part of the season, here's the offense, was that first half against the Raiders. And then they had the third quarter where they had, I think, 18 total yards of offense, and then they just couldn't do anything. Like, defense couldn't get a stop against Josh Jacobs, who had 2 touchdowns on the day, over 140 yards rushing. Then week 5, that was really the debacle. That's when Broncos country was like, oh, my gosh, this is bad. And Russ played very poorly against the Colts. Mm-hmm. And, he had 2 really bad interceptions he threw in that game. Obviously, there was the one play he locked onto Cortland when KJ Hamler was wide open. It's like, Russ struggled last year. And you could definitely tell that Russ was trying to do some things kind of on his own a little bit because However, whatever he and Nathaniel Hackett had envisioned for this offense, it did not mesh together.
No.
And then it was to the point where they were already so deep into it that it was like, well, let's just see what this week brings, you know? And that was something that did happen behind the scenes. Like, I'm not disputing that. And like I said, there was nothing in that report in The Athletic that struck me off guard, that I felt like, You know, I think the only thing that was questionable was, okay, unnamed sources said that Russell Wilson did this, which we talked about in the last segment. Outside of that, they talked to players, and there was player testimony in some of those things. And there were things that we already knew, like things that were publicized. Maybe not everybody, like in the social media, like it's crazy. Like you still see things today where people are reacting to Russell Wilson had his own office. People are like, oh my gosh, Russell Wilson had his own office? What? We knew that in training camp.
I know.
We talked about that in training camp, that he had his own office. Now, it wasn't an issue, right, because they hadn't played any games. And all of a sudden, we knew also, and we also reported it here on the show, they had these weekly State of the Union meetings with the offense where any player on the offense was invited. It wasn't mandatory, but you could go to these things, these meetings that Russell Wilson was holding.
I want to, or go ahead.
If Denver's winning, people are like, yeah, that's great. That's innovative.
Yeah. Denver
lost and Russ played really bad. It was like, oh my gosh, this guy had his own office. That's the thing I'm talking about. It's like people don't know how to differentiate that.
I want to bring it back to the term that you and I had kind of discussed yesterday, and this is how it kind of works the other way, is recency bias. Is people just love to see the last thing and base the future off of that completely. Look, is it valid to have concerns about Russell Wilson coming into this next season based off how he performed last season? Yes, I think that's totally valid. But at the end of the day, just because Russell Wilson had his worst statistical year last year for the Denver Broncos does not automatically mean that's a repeat.
Yeah, and it doesn't mean that what we're going to see in 2023 is going to be the same, right? You hope you see improvement from him. But, I mean, I feel like just seeing the type of person that Russell Wilson is, I know all this talk, it's definitely coming to him, right? I don't know if it's getting to him. I'm not going to speculate on it, but I know he sees it. He hears it. This is great motivation for him. And with Sean Payton, I think that things are not going to be easy. It's not, you're not going to be walking, this open field. It's going to be a tightrope with Sean Payton, which I think will be good for the Broncos. I think it'll be good for Russ. I would be shocked personally if Russ played just as bad or worse than he did last year.
And the reality situation is, Cody, if he does play like that, he's gone.
Then you're like, hey, this was a mistake. They'll find a way to move on, and then you have to admit that, okay, hey, we traded for this guy and we thought it was going to be this. It ended up not being that.
Russell Wilson deserves the benefit of the doubt with all that he's accomplished, all the winning, all the accolades that he's reached in his career. We're not talking about Case Keenum, a guy who was a flash in the pan in Minnesota, 1 year here, move on, whatever it might be. Russell Wilson, as bad as last year was on a Hall of Fame trajectory.
Yeah.
And if he continues to play like we know he can, like he did in Seattle, he's going to continue to be on that trajectory. To try to run him out of town after one god-awful season, which we can admit, it's a recency bias and it's a joke.
Well, and I think that's where people can't separate the logic in this whole entire situation is people, you can acknowledge he played badly, but then people are like, okay, this is who he is. He's not going to get better. I refuse to believe that in a sport where these guys are constantly training. And I alluded to it in the last segment that we did here. Was it possible that maybe Russ did a little too much and it impacted him? Yeah, I think that's certainly a possibility. There's times where
I did that when I first got my job here in My Life Sports.
You can under-prepare, you can over-prepare, and both can still hurt you, right? You don't have to do too much. Like, for a guy like Russ, he doesn't, in my opinion, I don't think he has to do too much. Just get back to the basics.
Yeah.
And we started to see we saw flashes last year. And we saw, I think, in the last 2 weeks of the regular season, we saw, okay, hey, this is the Russell Wilson that they initially were looking to bring in.
And why did we think we saw that? Because they refined the game plan.
Their game plan was this.
Simple.
We're going to run the football, and then we're going to roll Russell Wilson out.
Which is, and look, hindsight's always 20/20. They probably should have adopted that mentality going back to last season. But the reality situation is you live and you learn. You move forward. And I keep throwing out these mid to bad piss poor quarterbacks.
He's still the highest selling Broncos jersey on the team.
Yeah, people just love to talk down on this guy. It really does. It's surprising to me.
Well, it's just like as a human being, people are like, oh, you're a reporter, you cover the team, so why are you defending players? Like, somebody told me I actually work in PR. And I was like, if I do, please give me the raise that comes with working in PR. But everything has to be a personal attack on this guy. And that's the thing that irks me the most is seeing another human being talk to like that, having these things that aren't true said about him in terms of like who he is as like that. It bothers me because it's like I know firsthand that's not the case. I've had the chance to talk with Russell Wilson off the record in the locker. Like, this is a guy who really cares, wants to win, maybe cares a little too much about trying to win, right? And could it impact you? Certainly it can. But there are people that are going to take, the report, and like I said, the report that he wanted Pete Carroll gone, Schneider gone. Is there a truth to that? Possibly, right? Yeah. We don't know for sure. Russ has come out and refuted it, and they're like, oh, of course he's going to refute it. He's being like, if someone says something about you, like, and it's just constant, wouldn't you come out and speak out against it? Apparently, defending yourself means that whatever was said is actually true.
Yeah, and
that's the issue I have.
It's a weird dynamic involving Russell Wilson here now. So, I'm curious to see how this continues to play out. We'll see how it shakes out. But at the end of the day, people just love to hate on Russell Wilson, and away we go.